We'll let everybody have a minute to get in and get settled, and we'll get started in just a moment. Okay, I think we'll get started. Hello and good evening. Welcome to History Happy Hour, the long road to voting. My name is Callie McCune, and I'm the Public Programs Manager at the Indiana Historical Society. It is great to have so many of you here tonight to talk about women's suffrage. This History Happy Hour is brought to you with support from One America Financial Partners, a national provider in the insurances and financial marketplace. We're really appreciative to One America for their support of our History Happy Hour series and our ability to keep bringing it to you week after week. At the Indiana Historical Society, we are Indiana's storyteller, connecting people to the past. We do this by collecting millions upon millions upon millions of pieces of paper that tell Indiana's unique stories. These are things like books and paintings, letters and photographs, diaries and maps. And then we find intriguing and unexpected ways to share that and to remember the past through publications, exhibitions, or events like this. It is through these pieces that we are able to tell the diverse, unconventional, and sometimes even saucy stories of Indiana, and to inspire a future grounded in our state's uniting values and principles. Throughout the last year, we have been commemorating the voices of our Hoosier heroines and their persistent sisters from around the country who have fought for the right to vote. And tonight we're going to dig into that long march to voting just a little bit with two fantastic scholars, Dr. Joan Johnson of Northwestern University and Dr. Allison K. Lange of the Wentworth Institute of Technology. And for those of you that always come to our History Happy Hours, we have a special supersized edition. So stick around, we're going to go about 75 minutes tonight. I'm honored to say that this event is part of the Suffrage Centennial Block Party, a collaboration and partnership with the Indiana Women's Suffrage Centennial Commission, the Indiana Historical Society, the Indiana State Museum and Historic Sites, the Eiteljorg Museum, Indiana Humanities, and the Indiana State House Tour Office. We've been commemorating 100 years of women voting in Indiana through presentations and workshops, discussions and parties, and so much more over the last week. You can check out our last few events and resources at indianahistory.org/blockparty, and I hope you share your party with the hashtag Suffrage Block Party. We've got one more day. I can't wait to see your porch parties and to really get into that long fight for voting tonight. So before I introduce Anna, our moderator, I have just a couple pieces of logistics for you. So tonight, Anna and Allison and Jessica will chat for about 40 minutes, and then we'll open up to your questions. If you do have one at the end or else we're going along, please drop that in the question and answer section. We'll keep an eye on them and then pepper them in the second half of the program. We know you're all muted tonight, but we do want to hear your thoughts. Add your comments to the chat box as we go, and make sure you're replying to panelists and all attendees so everyone can see your reply. Also keep an eye on that chat box. We'll be dropping links and URLs as we go along, but don't worry if you miss one. We'll share all of those with you tomorrow in an email that'll be delivered to your inbox about noon. Just so that we're clear, this program is also being recorded, and you'll be able to catch the replay at indianahistory.org in the upcoming weeks, as well as part of the Suffrage Block Party retrospective at indianasuffrage100.org. If you enjoyed this program, we hope you do come back for more. Again, we're almost at the end of the Suffrage Block Party, but please join us tomorrow for our last coffee talk, and then we hope you throw a porch party in your backyard. And then join us for more History Happy Hours. Next week, we're back talking about Jewish migration to Indianapolis with Dr. Sue Hyatt, and then keep an eye out for future conversations on elections, transportation, wedding fashion, cemeteries, Kurt Vonnegut, and so much more. All of that is available at indianahistory.org for you to sign up for. So without further ado, I'll introduce you to Anna Barnett. She's a talented actor and one of our stalwart members of IHS's museum theater staff, and one of my go-to people when I have a crazy idea and need an actor to help me along. And she's the perfect person to talk tonight, and she's been portraying Indiana suffragists for over 25 years. So hi, Anna, thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Hello, nice to have you. Nice to be here. I'm glad that we're here. I do have a drink tonight. I have the White Lady, which I thought was appropriate since white is the one of the colors of suffrage. And this is a gin with triple sec and some orange juice and a little bit of zest in it as well. I'd like to ask Allison Lange if she will tell us what she's drinking and give a little introduction to herself and her work as well.
Hi, my name is Allison Lange, and I'm based in Boston at the Wentworth Institute of Technology. And my research is specifically on the images in the women's suffrage movement. So thinking about the ways that these suffragists really created a new image of womanhood in the United States, very much in contrast to the cartoons that were very popular. And we'll be talking more about those soon. But tonight I have, just a basic rosé, which I realize is anti-suffrage pink, but I put it in a yellow pro-suffrage colored glass. So surely that counts.
Absolutely. And our other panelist is Joan Johnson. Joan, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us your areas of expertise as well?
Sure. Hi, I'm really pleased to be here. So I'm a director for faculty at Northwestern in the Office of the Provost. Before that, I taught women's history for a long time. And my area of expertise has been in women's activism, and then more recently in women's philanthropy and funding change for women through funding the suffrage movement, as well as what they then called the birth control movement, opening up access to higher education for women, and also supporting women in the labor movement. And if we could have the slide. I think some of you may be familiar with what they call the suffragette cocktail. This came from the San Francisco call in 1909. This drink is vermouth. It's gin, vermouth, Italian vermouth, in equal parts. And they say about it, one makes a man willing to listen to the suffragettes, and they use the word suffragette, which was really more of a mocking tone. Suffragette's proposition: 2, convince him that it has some merit; 3, make him a missionary willing to spread the gospel abroad; and 4, make him go home and wash the dishes. So that would be kind of a typical reaction to thinking about how suffragists were threatening traditional gender roles. So I don't have a drink with me right now, but I may go make myself one of these afterwards.
that it sounds like a pretty strong drink, so perhaps
that's why I don't have it right now.
Conversation. Well, as we get started, we talk about the fight for suffrage, which was essentially a fight to convince men that women should vote. What kind of marketing tools did suffragists use to forward their cause? Allison, since you have a lot of visual images, would you like to take this on first?
Sure, I'd be happy to start us off with some images. I will never give a talk without them. The first one that I'd like you to see is this one called Bloomerism in Practice. And if it's not showing up super well on your screen, you're welcome to just Google Bloomerism in Practice. It's available through the Boston Public Library, so you should be able to get like a super high-res version that you could like zoom in on and see it as clear as you wish. And this was done in 1851, and this gives you a sense of why suffragists needed marketing. So I want to give you a sense of why they needed marketing before I tell you what they did. You can see from this picture, it's not a very flattering image. There is a woman who is so-called Mrs. Turkey, and she is supposed to represent women's rights activists. She's wearing bloomers, smoking, and has her hand kind of condescendingly placed on her, presumably her husband's head, who is hunched over, sewing some clothes. She's abandoned her child, who is in the front of the room crying because his mother is not caring for him, neglecting him as she is supposed to at this time. In the background, we have some additional figures. One is a Black woman, and she's smoking. Another one is a woman who I believe is supposed to represent a servant, a domestic servant of some kind. They're also both wearing bloomers, and they're both holding banners that one is against slavery, and the other is against housework, kitchen work. So the implication here is that not only will women kind of neglect their duties as homemakers, as wives, as caregivers, if they win any rights, they will also lead to a shift in racial hierarchy and class hierarchy. So anti-suffragists are connecting all of these things with the rise of women's activism that it sounds like, especially if you've been attending a lot of these events, you know is happening in by 1851 when this print is created. And so this is just one print that I'm showing you right now. And there are plenty more in my book. There are plenty more online. But this is an example of many others that were just like it that Americans encountered. So in response, suffragists actually created portraits of themselves. And this really was helped by a new type of technology, new type of photograph. And if you shift to the next slide, I hope we have Sojourner Truth and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony. Yes, we do. And they, Sojourner Truth is very much kind of like the earliest women's rights activist to distribute her portrait really meaningfully. You can tell here that she is trying to convince you that she looks nothing like the women that you just saw in that cartoon. And Stanton and Anthony really take up this idea. They see Truth's portraits, they realize that they're really powerful for calling attention to these individual women and making them look more like leaders and not just caricatures in cartoons. And then the next slide, we have a scene from two portraits rather from the series called The History of Women's Suffrage, which was published for the first time in 1881, but was part of a 6-volume series. And so this is kind of suffragists taking it to the next level to kind of create their own public relations campaign of what they look like. And then finally, this final slide, they are shifting again, beginning in the late 1890s and through the early 20th century. And by then, it's not these individual suffragists like Sojourner Truth and Susan B. Anthony creating these campaigns themselves, distributing these portraits themselves. It's by then a national press committee that these organizations have. They have their own publishing company. They have a new, wonderful rising generation of professional female artists, like this one is by Rose O'Neill. And they also have a new campaign slogan, which you can see here, and they are in direct response to those anti-suffrage images we looked at earlier. Not only will women become better mothers if they have the vote, they will be able to extend their motherly expertise into the public sphere. So it's a direct counter argument to that earlier cartoon that we saw. So there's the marketing campaign in just a few.
That's great, Allison. I really love these images, and I think I can speak to the words they used as well, right? So I loved that you brought up the publishing company. Suffragists really thought it was important to control their image through the actual imagery, right? And then also through who controls their voices, right? How do they control the narrative of what they're saying through their words as well? So it was really important to have a newspaper. That's one of the first things Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton do in the 1860s, right? They start the revolution. And Susan B. Anthony says it was to sauce back their opponents. So you can see the way they're saucing back their opponents in their words as well as in their images. I really love that. And of course, Black women are also controlling their voice and their narrative, especially through their images and also through their words. So in the 1890s, Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin will start not only the Women's Era Club, Black Women's Club in Boston, but also a newspaper that goes along with it so that they can be communicating internally with each other, but also externally to the public. That's really important. And then when the movement really begins to get much more attention and publicity by the 19 teens, it's very much helped along by having an infusion of cash in it, which allows them to take the reins on that publicity. And so Mrs. Frank Leslie inherited the Leslie Publishing Company when her husband died. And she had been just kind of a small, steady donor to the movement, but not an activist. She was not out there giving speeches, but she was giving $100 a year. And then when she died, she left her whole estate to Harry Chapman Catt, who was then became president of the national organization. And so the first thing Catt did was create that publicity campaign, right? She hired a whole staff of publicists, and they had the publishing bureau that could send out those images to combat, to sauce back their opponents, which was really, really important. And of course, she also wanted to do it with words. And so they bought back the Woman's Journal, which was a longstanding women's rights newspaper, but it was heavily in debt, and the National had taken it on earlier and had gotten rid of it because of the debt that they were in. And so at a time when the entire budget for the national organization was $38,000, the following year, they spent $75,000 just on the Woman's Journal, on their own newspaper. And so I think that shows just how important it was to really control their own image, literally through the images as well as through controlling their words with in print.
Was that influx of money all from the legacy of one person, or was there an increase in funding from a variety of sources at that time?
So that's a great question. There were, and it's kind of a both. There were a handful of, a couple dozen very, very wealthy white women who gave very large amounts of money. Alva Vanderbilt Belmont, I'll probably end up talking about her. She gave, you know, hundreds of thousands in addition to the million that Mrs. Frank Leslie left. And there were many others also. And there were also lots of small donations as well. So the National Women's Party, led by Alice Paul, kept a typewritten, I'm sorry I don't have the image with me, a typewritten book of every single donation they got from 1913 when they started until 1920 when the amendment passed. And it's over 200 pages, and it's got, you know, every 50 cent, every dollar donation, all the way up to Alva Belmont's $76,000 donation. So you can really see the range and how important all these donations were. But I do think it was this big infusion of this big money that allowed them to do things that they just previously hadn't been able to do before. And the other point that I would make about that is that if you're looking through the National Women's Party book of all its donors, there's a handful, I identified a handful of Black women. Certainly, I think we've all been talking about the role of women of color in the movement recently, and I hope a lot of you have been learning quite a bit about that recently. And so you know that at times Black women and other women of color were included in the movement. At other times they were excluded explicitly from the movement. And so what we more see are Black women supporting their own organizations rather than giving large donations to the two major national organizations. So for example, Mary Church Terrell, I believe, did give a small donation, but she was really supporting Black women's organizations much more heavily than that.
And did you have anything you wanted to add about the funding, Allison, that you'd like to discuss?
No, Joan is the expert.
Okay. Well, as a follow-up to that, did this funding, the funding that you were just speaking of, do you feel like it really affected who was included or excluded from the cause, as well as who they were marketing to? Joan, if you want to start, and then Allison after.
Yeah. So there were ways in which some of the donors did attach restrictions to their gifts and kind of said, you know, Alva Belmont insisted on initially Ida Harper and Anna Howard Shaw being able to have their positions as leaders in the movement, and she threatened to take away her money if they didn't. She had the headquarters moved to New York because she conditioned her donation on that move. So she definitely conditioned things on moves, and so or on her donations. And I would say that to that extent, some of the donors could be very powerful. And in as much as they echoed the exclusionary tactics of many of the other leaders in the movement, then they were not using their funding to make the movement more exclusive. Now, Belmont is really interesting because she comes into the movement really by like 1908, 1909, early 1909. And she then becomes one of the wealthy women who support the shirtwaist strike, which took place in New York City in November of 1909. There were several wealthy women who supported that, and she was paying bail for some of the strikers who were arrested. She's in court till 3 in the morning, putting her mansion up as collateral. And so she was purposely putting some of her money and her clout behind trying to involve working women to a greater extent in the movement and supporting them. But of course, they were already there and they already had their own organizations, and they kind of resented her. She sort of tried to swoop in as a savior, and they resented that. And so you do see that tension there. Interestingly, 2 months later, that January of 1910, she also met with Black suffragists in New York City with Irene Moorman, Sarah Garnett, and Maria Lawton. And they then had a public meeting that Moorman organized, and Belmont spoke to Black citizens in New York City, and they did form a branch of her organization. It ultimately, she essentially withdrew her support, and later that year, the PEA began to exclude Black members from some of their events, their lunchroom, etc. And then she ultimately ended up giving quite a bit of money to Kate Gordon's Southern organization, which explicitly was calling for suffrage just for white women and explicitly excluding Black women. So I think that's a really interesting question. In some ways, those donors used their money to, could use it to either be inclusive or exclusive, but I would say that in many ways they were kind of echoing the exclusion that was already present in the movement and shared by other members as well. Allison, do you want to jump in on that?
Sure, yeah, and I'd be happy to talk through actually the next batch of my slides, which I think will build on exactly what Joan is saying, which is that this funding is really crucial for, you know, advancing a particular idea. And I just showed a bunch of images that, like this one, this is the kind of image that the National American Women's Suffrage Association, just like the colorful one by Rose O'Neill that we looked at previously, really emphasized that these white middle and upper class mothers who can afford to stay home with their children in these kind of ideal homes, they're able to kind of have the money to create those really important campaigns. And if we look at the next slide, we can see that their campaigns really do shift the conversation in the popular press. This is the type has changed, showing what the previous idea of what suffragists looked like where it was, and the changing idea of what suffragists were looking like. These very fashionable, wealthy, beautiful, white, elegant women. And so there's and it's exactly because they have the funding to do this, right? National American Women's Suffrage Association starts having press committees in 1890. And so they're hiring publicity professionals much earlier. And if we shift to the next slide, which is a portrait of a woman, a suffragist that we were just speaking about, Mary Church Terrell, she was the first president of the National Association of Colored Women, which was founded in 1896. And this organization was founded because the white female-led organizations were really thinking about the ways that race was affecting who could vote, right? So by 1896, I'm sure a lot of us already know, a lot of the discriminatory voter laws that were being passed in the South are being, Black women are not only fighting for the right to vote for themselves, they're also fighting for the right to vote of Black men at this time by 1896. And they don't have the funding to create this kind of publicity campaign that we're talking about here. If we shift to the next slide, Mary Church Terrell is amazing because she spent a lot of her own money and a lot of her own time to distribute portraits of herself. And you can see that this is an example of a flyer that was announcing one of her lectures. She is extraordinarily elegant. She loved fashion. If you look at photographs of her over the years, she has amazing hats. There's one with like a feather boa. She loved fashion and wanted to make sure that everyone who saw her knew that she was a dignified, elegant woman. She's one of the first Black women in the United States to complete an undergraduate degree. She was from a quite wealthy family, actually. So she is definitely parallel to this other image you see on the screen, which is the idealized version of a new Negro woman from about the same time period. And it's not it's not by chance that they look incredibly similar to each other. And so I wanted to also show you this final image. So as I said, there's really no publicity campaign that's launched by the National Association of Colored Women. But in all my years of research, I finally found one propaganda image emphasizing that Black women needed the vote as mothers. And that was published by the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. It's published as a poster, it's published in their periodical, The Crisis, and you can see that this woman has a bat labeled the Federal Constitution, and she has her children in her skirt. She's trying to protect them against Jim Crow laws and segregation. And so I think this is a really interesting image, whereas a lot of the other images I've talked about today were incredibly popular and representative of many more that are similar. This is a really unusual, more unique image there just weren't that many propaganda images that emphasized that Black women needed the vote. And that's because they really didn't have the funding for it. And Terrell really tried, but they just didn't have the resources.
Thank you both very much. Allison, you make the argument that white suffragists portrayed themselves as educated moral elites. Does that clash? And we just saw here how that is not necessarily the case. There were lots of Black women who were very educated and moral elite. And you showed us these two images. Do you think that these images are, were they both national images, or were they just being shown to Black segregated audiences? Was this something that the people who were creating it wanted white audiences to see, or did the white audiences care that the Black audience was having this effort alongside?
Are you talking about the final one that you're looking at?
Actually, both the final image that we looked at and the one before of the portrait, and I'm sorry, I can't remember her name.
Terrell, yeah.
Yes, both of those, because I think both are very striking images that we as white people don't see a lot when we're learning about suffrage history. So at the time they were being published, were they more readily available to the white audiences, or were they specifically being marketed only to Black audiences?
That's a really important question. And so with so this particular portrait, I love this portrait of Terrell. She looks like the boss that I imagine her to be. She was born in 1863. She lived into the 1950s and was picketing segregated restaurants in Washington, D.C. in her 80s. So she's an extraordinary person to look into. The very first biography is coming out about her later this year. I'm very excited about it. But if we shift to the next slide, you can see that the one on the left is from a publicity brochure. So it's something that if someone was interested in seeing her talk, they went to her event or had an advertisement for her event, they would have seen it. So this was a more public image. And it is certainly the case that Terrell actually spoke at a National American Women's Suffrage Association convention. So plenty of white women did see her in person even. And she was also particularly famous for going to Berlin in 1904 to an International Women's Suffrage Association meeting. And they actually were incredibly impressed by her because she delivered her speech there in German. And so people were really impressed with her. White people and the entire audience alike was incredibly impressed with her. So the publicity image we see on the left side is something that would have been available to anyone who was interested in her work. The one on the right is precisely from Voice of the Negro, which was a really elite, kind of more academic African-American journal from this time period. So the audience might have been a little bit more heavily skewed Black, I would guess. And then as far as the broadside goes, the broadside that was also published in the Crisis, the NAACP was a really a fairly integrated organization. There are a lot of white men and women who helped found that organization. So that's actually a flyer that probably was seen by a fair number of people, but they were probably reformers, like probably social justice activists of that time period rather than kind of a general public.
Yeah, I think Allison makes a really great point, which is that these images, I think, are circulating more among African Americans themselves, but these Black women were putting their bodies, their physical selves, right, into spaces where they were representing themselves. So they were bringing that image in person into some of these meetings, and certainly representing themselves in this manner, and really very concerned about how they were seen within these meetings, and also with letting, when they showed up looking this way, right, as this kind of lady, essentially, it was what allowed them to entrance into some of these white meetings and white organizations. And then it was also what kind of undergirded how they were then able to start to make, to try to make whites aware of what their situation was, right? And sometimes that entree was to sort of come in as someone who is also middle or upper class, and is not being treated with the respect and dignity that white women are being treated. So they will tell stories about what it was like to ride on a Jim Crow car to the city where the event is being held. And so in some ways it was that white women could kind of see them maybe as someone they could perhaps relate to based on class and that genteel image, and then hear what's happening to them and see it in a different light. So I think that was really important.
This is a question I'm sure you both have answers to, but Joan, I'm going to ask it to you first. It's easy for history to get misconstrued as we retell it. What are the popular misconceptions you think people have about suffrage, and what would you want to bust tonight if you could pick one?
Lots.
Where do you start?
I know, right? I think we're beginning to really see the role and to be able to talk about both inclusion and exclusion of women of color. We're beginning to learn more. Historians have been studying Latina women, Chinese American women, Chinese immigrant, as well as American born women. And so we're beginning to Native American women. So we're beginning to learn their stories as well, I think. And also historians have begun to really talk about the role of queer women in the movement and what it meant that many of the leaders in the national organizations were lesbian partners with other women, and what their identity and those relationships meant for their ideas about what equality was and why they needed access to employment. And if you weren't going to be in a heterosexual marriage, what kind of rights did you think about as a woman, right? So I think we're beginning to see a lot more of that coming out, which allows us to think about these women a little bit differently and maybe shatter some of those images of the proper mother, the genteel mother that Allison shared with us. So I think those are really important. And then I think another thing that I would say is that that is also really important because it's when the movement does expand that way and become a movement that is more inclusive of especially working class women, but also across the regions, that really we begin to see much more success, if you will, right? That we begin to see laws changing and then finally the amendment passing. So that's a really important part of the story.
Allison, what would you like to bust tonight?
Well, I think that, one of the favorite lines, I'm sure, Joan, you've seen this a million times, that the 19th Amendment guaranteed the women the right to vote or something along those lines. And that is absolutely not true. In fact, no one has a constitutionally guaranteed right to vote in the United States, even in 2020. As some of you probably already know, the 19th Amendment was based on the text of the 15th Amendment, which was passed in 1870, which prohibited voter discrimination based on race. And so the 19th Amendment prohibited voter discrimination based on sex. But as suffragists already knew by 1890, just because you prohibited voter discrimination based on race doesn't mean you can't add a literacy test in there or a grandfather clause or a poll tax to kind of limit your voter base. One of the really important court cases that I think often we don't think about is Minor versus Happersett. And this came about after the 1872 presidential election, when suffragists like Sojourner Truth and Susan B. Anthony actually did cast a ballot in that election. But Virginia Minor was not able to register. And she took that case actually up to the Supreme Court, and that Supreme Court ruling, Minor versus Happersett, declared that voting is not a citizenship right. And so that's what paved the way for those discriminatory voting laws in 1890. And it paved the way for many of the conversations we are still having right now on the eve of yet another major election about who can vote and who cannot vote, because no one has this constitutional protected right to vote.
Thank you. We'll move forward a little bit in time. How do you see the organizing from women's suffrage movements play out after August of 1920? Does it affect how women advocate for causes going forward? Joan, would you like to start again on that one? Do you need me to repeat the question? I stumbled it a little bit.
So I think you had also asked me to think about how women's funding for women's activism for different causes continues as well, right? So we know women there are prohibitions put into law, as Allison just said, on the basis of sex, and we know that that this affected different groups of women differently, and that women will begin to organize in many different ways. First of all, to take advantage of the right to vote right and to learn what it means to be a voter, and to educate themselves about elections and their rights, and then to try and register to vote with varying degrees of effect, in part depending on their race. We also see a lot of different changes politically in terms of where social reform is going in the 1920s. And so some of women's activism that was taking place in women's organizations kind of ebbs and flows and shifts with the times in terms of some of the social activism, which is less prominent in the 1920s. And women also begin to get involved in lots of different kinds of organizations, which may not be gender-based anymore. They're not coalescing around one issue like the right to vote. In terms of funding, this is a really interesting question because I have some information about how wealthy women tried to fund change for women in the middle of the 20th century and up through the women's movement, whether it was Catherine McCormick paying for dormitories at her alma mater, MIT, because in the 1950s, there were hardly any more women there than there had been when she graduated in 1904. And it's really after she gives money for dormitories that she can make a change, because women weren't being accepted because they had nowhere to house them. And we also see someone like Abigail Disney, who does give some of her money to the women's movement in the 70s, but we don't really know a lot of those stories about where women are giving their money and how they're funding women's issues, whether it's the women in the labor movement or other kinds of causes for women through that time period. And now we're seeing a lot more attention to women's giving and funding for reproductive rights, for economic equality, for a lot of other different causes. But there's a lot of work to be done to understand what happens in the mid to late 20th century. So that kind of went in circles a little bit, but maybe Allison can kind of build on that.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that, telling the history of women's rights activism in the last century is like basically impossible in 30 seconds. But one thing I think that, carried forward, we've already mentioned the fact that a lot of women, continue to fight for the right to vote long after the passage of the 19th Amendment, and some of our audience members might even kind of be really familiar with that from other talks. Mary Church Terrell, for example, asked Alice Paul, the leader of the National Women's Party, take up this, make sure the 19th Amendment is being enforced, make sure that women of color in the South can actually register to vote. And, what we see in the archives over and over again is these white leaders saying, not my problem, we're focused on sex, we're not focused on race. But they're just not getting the fact that these things, some people are, a woman and a person of color, and they're not seeing how those things are connected, unfortunately. And it's really devastating, quite frankly, to read these letters in the archives. But one of the things I think that we're also stuck with, besides this lack of cohesiveness that we see, lack of inclusiveness that we see among suffragists, is that image that we were looking at earlier of the ideal woman, managing her home, but also being fashionable and, having the right body, the right look, the right style. And I think that, the suffragists are really kind of the first group to argue that women can do it all, right? And they are arguing that because the counter argument is that women cannot handle anything but the home, right? So they're really trying to make that case. And I think one of the things we're seeing even right in this particular incredibly challenging moment, you've seen maybe a slew of articles looking at the fact that women are trying to manage caring for their families, their households, caring for older relatives, in addition to their full-time jobs, in addition to everything else. and how this is affecting even, for example, I'm a professor, this is affecting even journal submissions, article submissions, the statistics showing that women are not being as professionally productive as they would, as men are right now. So I think that, there are a lot of important legacies for us to be aware of when we're thinking about the suffragists, some of which are positive. The 19th Amendment is certainly unequivocally a positive thing, but some of which are far more complex that deserve, thoughtful consideration.
Thank you very much. Oh, we have some questions here that are starting to come in from our guests that are listening, and I want to encourage you, audience, that if you have a question for anyone, for either of our panelists, to please put it in the question and answer area so that I'll be able to ask it to our panelists. But I think we're going to start with our first question, and this question is, can Dr. Johnson talk about what kind of motivations the big dollar donors gave to their suffrage philanthropy? Why that cause and not others?
Oh, okay. So that's a really great question, because many of these wealthy white donors who I'm looking at in the book, they come to the suffrage movement because they feel that despite their privilege, they've still experienced sex discrimination of one form or another. And whether it's not being allowed to go to college and get the same kinds of jobs in the family business the way their brothers can, or whether it's Alva Belmont being angry that her husband's cheating on her blatantly and she can't really do anything about it. And so they're looking at what power, whether it's economic or respect, or their standing within the family, they still lack despite their other privileges. And in that sense, it's not actually that they just choose suffrage, because most of the women that I write about show up in chapter after chapter in my book, which means that not only are they giving to the suffrage movement, but they're also either founding a college or for women, or they're giving a donation in order to force a men's college to open its doors to women and become coeducational, or they're giving those dormitories to MIT to make it truly become coeducational. Catherine McCormick was a vice president of NASA, of the National Association for Suffrage. She also is the one who funded the research for the birth control pill. So you find a bunch of suffragists also giving to the birth control movement in New York City in the 19-teens. So they're looking holistically at all these factors as to how women need economic independence, they need more opportunity in education and employment, they need their legal rights and their voting rights in order to make some of these other rights happen, and they need to have social rights in which they can control their bodies and their image and their respect within families. And they see them all as all connected, certainly. In some cases, that if they got the right to vote, these other rights would follow, which I think is kind of an interesting way to look at it. But they're definitely funding much more than suffrage.
Thank you. Allison, the next question is actually for you. Some of the images that were published in the crisis, I'm sorry, I'm reading something that's here. Can you speak to Jane Addams' involvement in the crisis and the publishing of some of those images? I think that's what the question is asking.
Yeah, so Jane Addams was actually one of the early founders of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. So one of this was a interracial effort. This wasn't something that one group founded specifically. And so she is certainly a longtime suffragist as well. She is, despite the fact that, as Joan was already mentioning earlier, she's one of these women who did have a longtime female partner. Despite the fact that that is the case, she was really advocating kind of this municipal housekeeping kind of emphasis on the home and the family argument to win the vote, which I think is a really fascinating contradiction in the ways that they are, trying to present a particular public image for a very particular reason. And that's often kind of, covering up the reality of the situation, which is that Adams never married and never had kids and had a very intimate relationship with, oh my goodness, Ellen Gates Starr. I'm gonna forget exactly her name.
Mary Rose. Oh
my gosh. Wendy Rouse's article. If you look up the Suff Buffs, and you find Wendy Rouse's article, I think it's like the Queer Women of the Suffrage Movement. She definitely has the correct name of her and many other really leading suffragists. So Jane Addams is very much a suffragist. She is a pro-peace advocate. That's another one of her movements, a civil rights advocate. She's actually the first American woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize. So she has her hands in a lot of activist circles.
Okay. I think this question is for both of you. This is from Mona. Do you know if any parents of presidents of the U.S. fought for suffrage either before or after 1920? So that's parents of presidents.
I don't think I know the answer to that one.
No, I don't know the answer to that one either. What I will say is that when you look at the Men's Suffrage Association in New York City, it is largely made up of men whose wives or daughters or mothers or sisters were suffrage activists, and they kind of bring them in. So, so that's a really interesting question.
Thank you.
One of the early presidents who made a big difference, I think, was Theodore Roosevelt. And I think that's always surprising too, considering his emphasis on, a particular brand of masculinity. He's one of the early, really leading figures who endorsed suffrage, but it's after he was president, unfortunately.
This question is for Dr. Lange. Have you noticed anything about which images are circulating most often during the centennial celebration, so this year, or at other commemorative moments in the past? I'm curious about thoughts on which historic images are popular now and why you think they are popular now. And that's from Leah.
That's a really great question. And that's something that, I've been thinking about for a long time, right? A lot of the images that that we're thinking about with, probably if anyone wanted to call up a portrait of Susan B. Anthony, you can probably, perhaps, particularly this group, imagine what she looked like. And that's because she worked so hard to distribute her portrait during her lifetime, which means that a lot of archives across the country have a copy of her portrait. And so traditionally, she was an incredibly visible person. Alice Paul, also very visible. And Sojourner Truth, interestingly, also visible because she also distributed her portrait so widely. So those are some particularly common images. One of the other additional components is that a lot of organizations don't have the funds to, go get image permission fees for any particular image that they might want to use. And one of the really exciting things that's been happening in the last, let's say, decade or so, is that a lot of institutions like the Library of Congress have been able to make a lot of these images more widely available to the public. They're free, they're online. If you look up suffrage images in the Library of Congress website, loc.gov, you can see an amazing array of suffrage imagery. They actually just finished, they officially announced that all of Mary Church Terrell's papers have not only been digitized, but they have also been transcribed. And so that is an incredibly exciting thing because, as Joan probably knows very well, a lot of the archives that that house a lot of papers of women of color are very under-resourced, very underfunded. And so being able to have that kind of access to not only their papers, but also their portraits is changing who we see as the faces of that movement. So that's really exciting. I think we're seeing a lot more portraits of Mary Church Terrell since the Library of Congress digitized those a few years ago.
I believe this one is for you, Dr. Johnson. What intersections do you see among funding for women in political movements or for funding for women as business owners? And that's from Adrian.
That's a very interesting question too. I assume that's a question about the present.
I am assuming that as well.
Yeah. So, and funding for women.
Funding for women in political movements and funding for women as business owners.
So one of the studies that has come out came from the National Center for Responsible Politics. I think that's what it's called. They do the tracking on campaign finance for Congress. So they're tracking all the public records of who's giving how much to people who are running for Congress. And as we all know, we had a slew of women running in 2018. What they found is that while women's giving to congressional candidates overall is very slowly increasing year over year, when you dig into that increase and who's getting it, and women are really funding this movement of women into Congress. The top recipients of women's donations are women, and women candidates who receive the most money from women are receiving, more than 50, 60, 70% of their donations from other women. So really women are literally making it possible for many of these women to get into Congress. And certainly one of the biggest barriers to running is the fundraising. So I think that's absolutely essential, really, really important. And of course, that's made up of a lot of small donations as well as some of the larger donations. In terms of women funding women in business, definitely I would say a lot of women's foundations and women's funds, and there are a lot of donors who are interested in really funding women-owned businesses and using economic independence and economic power as that lever to get all these other rights, rather than, if you get the right to vote, these other things will happen. Instead, a lot of folks, I think, have the approach of, if we can get people economic independence, then they will be able to get all these other rights as well. And Melinda Gates, one of probably the most well-known women donors currently, is someone who has really espoused that view. She has certainly put her money behind, historical efforts, as well as funding for reproductive rights. But her biggest campaign has really been to empower women economically, both here in the United States as well as internationally. And she really believes that that's the way to make fundamental change for women, that all of the other rights are going to follow.
Okay. I want to let all of our audience know that we have about 10 more minutes before the event ends. And we have a question that goes out to both of you. If you want people to learn more about women's suffrage, where would you suggest they start? And do you have a favorite source you'd like to share with the audience? Allison, do you want to
I'm happy to jump in based on your previous answer, actually, Joan, which is to say that I worked on a website called Truth Be Told, which was funded actually by Melinda Gates's charitable organization, Pivotal Ventures, which might be a really cool place to start looking at not only like a history of kind of particularly Black suffragists, but also it features some really wonderful primary sources. And I must say that Sojourner Truth's portrait is one of my favorite primary sources because it tells us so much about her. She was born enslaved in New York. She, in her 30s, became a free woman for the first time. And she went on to become this leader in civil rights movements and women's rights movements. And she sat for her portraits actually at a time when some leading white activists were writing about her. Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote this article called The Libyan Sibyl. And probably what a lot of people know of her is this kind of mythical anti-woman speech, which as far as historians can tell, resembles like nothing perhaps that she ever actually gave. But we do have this photograph of her. And we know that she loved the way she portrayed herself in this photograph because she does it over and over and over again across several different sittings. And she copyrights it herself, which was incredibly unusual at that time. Most famous figures left them in a photography studio for the photographer to sell. And so she maintained an incredible amount of control over this portrait to tell her own story, make sure people knew who she was. And I think that that's just, it's fascinating to me. And, you know, she was an incredible figure.
I think one of the things that's really remarkable is I think when I started writing this, you know, that I was really having to travel to archives and to open up those dusty boxes and pull out physical letters to read them. And really, it's unbelievable how much things have changed over the last 10 years and how many sources are now digitized, whether it's through the Library of Congress, other kinds of collections, you know, just comes to mind Jane Stanford. Stanford Archives has really digitized most of her papers. I mean, the list goes on and on of the sources that you can find online. There's so many images and there's also just so many letters. These women wrote letters all the time. And the nice thing is if you're more interested in the 20th century than the 19th century, many of them are typewritten, which is really nice, but they give us these windows into the friendships and relationships that they formed, which I think are really, really important and help us to think about, you know, social movements today and social activism and how those relationships and bonds that we form are so important and really help develop the movement. They also show us the malicious side when, you know, you're reading letters from an organization and sometimes these letters go around and around to different people and they're calling out people for behavior they don't like, or, you know, you can kind of see who gets along with who. You can figure out the politics of some of these organizations and you can start to tease out where there were differences that were based on ideology or where there were differences that were based on what kinds of tactics you preferred, where there were differences. There was a lot of fighting over money. You know, I started following the money and that's one of the big causes for the fights that Alice Paul had with the rest of the national organization because she was fundraising and kind of keeping the money for her own activism for the parade and other things she was funding. And Catherine McCormick and others in the national organization were just furious. Catherine was so mad that she apparently turned her chair around at a meeting that they were supposed to iron out their differences, and she turned her chair around and wouldn't speak to her. So I do think that when you're combing through these resources, you can really find all sorts of stories that really help us to see the good, the bad, the organizing, the tactics, the strategies. There's just so many different angles to the movement. And they're all in there in those millions of letters that they wrote.
Thank you. And since I work at the Indiana Historical Society, I have to say that we have a great collection of primary documents in our library as well. And we'd love to have you come and do research, and our librarians do an excellent job of helping you, especially if you don't have a lot of experience in doing primary research. Our librarians are there to help guide you, and so you're not doing it all on your own. And while we certainly you do have to make an appointment now at our library because of COVID, because we want to make sure that you and our librarians are safe. And Callie has put up the way to make that appointment in the chat room. We
I
have,
have to say, I highly recommend it. There's nothing like the feeling of holding an actual letter in your hand and reading it. It's very moving. So
yeah, it is. And all three of our you are theirs, which the third one will open up here at the end of the month, are within 12 years of each other. The earliest is 1915, the latest is 1927. So if you want to see how far women's rights change in just that 12-year period, we're there. And while women's suffrage is not the primary focus, we certainly are happy to talk about suffrage in those spaces as well, and how women's lives have changed in such a short period of time. I have one quick question for Dr. Lange. As we have time, what, if any, common themes do you see between the images created during the suffrage movement and images created by women running for elected office later?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. One of the things that is pretty central in especially the National American Women's Suffrage Association campaign is, of course, this emphasis on motherhood. And I see a lot of gestures toward that, even in the 21st century, whether it's on a social media account for a political candidate, or even Kamala Harris, the new vice presidential candidate, introduced herself as Mamala at one point. And even though she's not a mother, she is a stepmother, the emphasis, she found it necessary to kind of emphasize that caregiving component of her life, which I think is really interesting. And I think that, we see that being echoed in a lot of ways, not just, on a Democratic VP ticket, but far beyond that, across party, across the United States.
Well, thank you. We just have a couple minutes left, and as we're closing up, in just a minute or two, could you tell us what are you working on next? What's the next thing you're doing? Joan, if you want to start there.
Writing a short book on suffrage. It's a history of the movement for use in college classrooms. So it's kind of gathering up all these fantastic stories that all these other historians have been talking about, and putting it in a format that hopefully will be useful for college classrooms.
And Allison?
I am currently just pushing through suffrage projects at the moment. I do a lot of public history projects like the Truth Be Told website. And so I've been really working a lot on that. I might end up doing something next on visual culture more broadly, and we'll see. We'll keep you posted.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate you both taking the time today to talk with us, and I'm going to turn it over to Callie so she can give some closing remarks, but we appreciate all of your expertise that we had tonight.
This was great. Thank you all so much for being here and chatting. I had a great time listening to the conversation. We are back next week with more History Happy Hours. So come talk with me about Sephardic Judaism in Indianapolis with Dr. Sue Hyatt. I promise it'll be a blast and a half. But then keep an eye out for more History Happy Hours on transportation, elections, cemeteries, wedding fashion, and more. Same time, same place, new Zoom link. You sign up for all of that at indianahistory.org. And then we hope we'll see you at the end of the block party. Again, tomorrow we've got one more coffee break, one more lunch and learn, and then we can't wait to see what amazing porch parties you all create. So please share that with us using the hashtag suffrage block party or hashtag porch party. If you missed your chance to donate or would like to make a future gift, a further gift to the Indiana Historical Society, we're going to drop that link into the chat in just a minute. Your donation allows us to keep doing events like this and offer them for free and keep engaging in the conversation. You're going to get an email from us tomorrow morning with links and a link to a survey. It will take you 2 minutes. We'd love to know what you thought, how we can keep programs like this going in the future, make them better, and keep collaborating with our amazing partners from around the state. And this conversation will be posted to YouTube in the upcoming weeks, so keep an eye out for the replay. With all that, thank you so much. Stay safe, stay sane, stay healthy, and we can't wait to see you at the next event. Bye, everybody.